everyone. So, we haven't talked about this in a while, and I'll be honest, that's because of my own hesitation. I am human, and I have a tendency, just like anyone else, to avoid things that I am feeling uncomfortable about. I put up with a moderate level of shit, not too much, not huge amounts, but enough that I kind of have to, choose my battles, right? As many of us do. The reason I'm telling you this is because the last time we discussed integral theory, the responses online were mixed. Now, I can't know for what level at all what people's responses are on the outside, beyond what people send me. But in our own Discord, we had a lot of people who were getting very upset and triggered. There's a whole video talking about this, where I kind of deconstruct the reasons why I don't like the attacks on me personally, or the belief that because I find parts of this theory useful, I am suddenly my word becomes useless. This is a thing I'm actually seeing in a lot of comments and a lot of things. Is it's the essentialization problem, right? We had a comment currently on the channel where on the Vosh discussion of gender, there was somebody saying, oh, making fun of gamer gender goes against the whole idea. To which my response is, again, find me someone who has that gender. If they can genuinely make it make sense to me, I'm down. But a gamer is a very broad identifier, and to me, it makes more sense for more ephemeral, the more ephemeral ideas of identity. That's a harder sell for me. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to respect that person or that I don't think they're valid, but I do feel like, to some degree, what people are doing in that case is defending a straw man. Like, oh, well, this would be valid too. Not necessarily, because, again, super straight's not valid. Why? Because we can see that it's built on a false premise. It's built on a bad premise. Gamer gender, as Vosh went over, built on a nonsense premise. Another one we get shit for occasionally is the Wii Spa stuff, because people are like, oh, this aged like milk. It doesn't age like shit. I haven't gotten any new information on it, and we gave what we could at the time. I'm sorry that they're too stupid. We had another comment where somebody decided to go off and basically say that we were being supporters of white supremacy because we didn't like the way Professor Flowers basically shared her ideas, and then said that we hid the video on that when I decided not to post the segment because that segment didn't feel great to me. It didn't feel like we got our ideas across well, and it didn't seem like it worked really well. So I do try to hear these critiques, and I do try to deal with them, and I respond when I can. If there's something that is good faith, then I try to respond as best I can, but when they feel bad faith, we literally just delete them. But in the Discord, we try to be fair to people. We try to assume that they're coming in good faith. And so I've been hesitant for a month or two maybe, to actually talk about this topic because I don't like the responses I get from it. Rather than trying to find the utility in various parts of this theory, people feel like they have to accept something whole cloth and not tear it apart or do their own research. And so that's why I've been a little bit hesitant. The lack of nuance and the lack of assuming the other person in good faith is really fucked. So, despite my whining, here we are. We're here to talk about this theory, and we're here to go over it. We're going to cover the last section, and I'm going to talk about my critiques of it. I may not remember all of them, and in a future integral video, I may go over more of them. I didn't have a chance to put up a list, but I probably remember most of them. If Hanging Wednesday is in the chat, feel free to let me know. Oh, CSY, that's so fucking cool. I appreciate that. Means a lot. That means a lot.
That's really pretty cool. We tried really hard.
That
so great. Thank you.
Based and journalism pilled. I am not a journalist. I'm a counselor and a bitch. So
and my sexy partner.
Also that. So let's get on with it. The last time we spoke, we have talked in depth about 4 other pillars of integral theory. Those have included quadrants, levels, lines, and states. Quadrants refer to 4 rough ways to break down reality: subjective, objective, intersubjective, and interobjective. Or another way to say this, Subjective is the internal experience of the person. The objective is the objective reality of the thing we can measure, the numerical or the quantitative. The intersubjective is the experience of the group, the we space, right? Whether that's a family, a tribe, a culture, whatever. And we can then talk about interobjective things that are not necessarily objective in the same way that say an atom is. But we can talk deeply about the fact that there appears to be, based on the data we can see around them, systems that actively and completely affect our lives. We could talk about this with systemic racism. We could talk about this with capitalism. We could talk about this with classism. We could talk about this with any number of things. Intersectional sociology and Marxism and a lot of other disciplines tend to bounce between intersubjective and interobjective phenomenon, right? Now, these are broad categories because what they're trying to point out is the way that human experience breaks down. That before we can come to any of these disciplines, and you can argue which ones are where, I don't give a fuck. All it's pointing out is this inherentness to our perspective. Now, there is a thing we may cover in a future video called integral methodological pluralism, that talks about this a little bit more in depth and points out the way that quadrants actually have two discrete phenomenon within each one. But we'll cover that at another time. We also talked about levels, referring to psychology and its study of development and the ways in which many developmental systems, whether we're talking about Fowler's faith systems, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're talking about Susan Cook-Reuter's ego development that her and Lovager had, or we're talking about Claire Graves and Don Beck spiral dynamics, which focuses on values. What it looks at, or what it focuses on, is there appears to be a pattern in each of these systems that can be sort of shorthanded to colors. That is, there appears to be these ways in which each of these different levels seem to describe a wide range of phenomenon and a wide range of thinking and level of complexity of thinking. And the short version of this is, if we don't get into the higher levels, it's just simply pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And we discuss the ways in which those three interact in our modern world. The way in which post-conventional and pre-conventional get confused for one another, both by post-conventional people and conventional people. The conventional people, because they can't conceive of a higher level of development, they literally can't. Development is not like just a set of glasses you're wearing. It's literally the worldview you live in. So the ideas of understanding like a postmodern perspective, no, it just sounds like hippie bullshit. Right? Post-conventional people can't tell the difference because they're both non-conventional. They don't understand it, and because they have an allergy to the idea of hierarchy in any form, there tends to be a thing of trying to equalize between people that may not be actually equal at a certain existential level. That's not to say they're not equal on another existential level or they're not equal at a societal level, but just to say that people who want to properly protest and fight, back against certain issues are great. The people that want to, commit terrorist acts in support of those things, not so much. We talked about lines in regards to how there appears to be, besides just levels, there are lines of development. Just like we talked about with those different researchers, each of those lines appears to be a really useful way to describe the person, right? And so what that means is that when you're trying to describe the person, when you're trying to describe an individual, I tend to focus only on self. I think trying to figure out other people's development is really weird and gets into some really weird projection, as I'll talk about in a bit. But if we're just trying to understand where we're at, it's like, okay, well, kinesthetically, there are probably sports people who are very high developmentally. They have a level of kinesthetic awareness, a level of proprioception, a level of embodied awareness that just blows everyone else out of the water, but they're not fucking astrophysicists, right? So we can say that there are these two different lines, cognition and physicality or kinesthetic. That's a thing. So that's quadrants, levels, lines, and then we talked about states, the one that got everyone fucking tripped up. States are just a representation of what appears to be either, and this is either as and possibly both, either brain states that appear to be universal to the person, they are universal to human beings as a whole, and we even see them in certain other mammalian species, and it appears that these states are accessible either through the imbibing of certain things, that is exogenous state training, or through practice, through endogenous state training, right? Through meditation, shit like that. These different states point to a way in which we conceive of reality and may even point to ways that we have biases to our way of thinking of reality. For example, if you read things like books on Sufism or Zen, where you talk about ideas of non-duality, there appears to be a way in which if you break apart the separation between self and other, there appears to just be isness or oneness. Now, I know that sounds like spiritual dribble, but that appears to be the experience, and it's been my experience in the past. I think the difference is that the ego has a bad tendency to sort of take that thing and go, oh, everything's connected, it's so great. When in reality, it's just the unification of reality, and it's just not that important. It's just what is. As they said in I Heart Huckabees, that interconnection thing is so true, yeah, and it doesn't matter. It matters until it doesn't. So states can be really useful to improve development, improve your sense of being. This is why meditation has such great effects on people. Unless they're dealing with depression, in which case there's some questions about which type of meditation, otherwise there could be some contraindication. But, point being, this is why one state experience can be seeing God, and another state experience can be realizing that you are and are not God. Both and. People sometimes give me shit in the Discord because when they ask me questions about Zen, I end up sort of challenging them because it's sort of a bad habit I got from Zen. We had a tendency to do Dharma combat, which was some motherfucker wanted to argue with you about Zen, you come at it. Not aggressively, not harmfully, but you come to bang, right? To quote Nate Diaz. So, what I want to point out is that these four pillars are the ones that I think I feel the most confident about. States, because I've experienced those states both through the imbibing of entheogens, or psychedelics. By the way, that's a joke. I've never done that. And levels of development, because there seems to be data to support this, including some of the upper levels that Susan Cook-Reuters looked at. Quadrants seem to make sense to me on an instinctual level, at very least as a shorthand to describe these things, because when you break down perspective upon perspective and you just go to the source, you just go to simple subjective awareness, or what's called witness, this really just seems solid. It just seems like there's just the ways in which perspective, or the way in which the ego constructs perspective, split. And in some ways, you can see not only are issues sometimes developmental problems, that is, different levels of development being in conflict, partially because they have allergies with one another and the like, but sometimes the way in which it's interpreted by the state is interpreted by the development creates issues as well, right? If everybody's seeing God, but if they all think it's a different God, that creates some issues. A good example of this is Patton Oswalt's sky cake joke. If you want to ever find that and offend everybody. So that's the overview. So let's get into this shit, because it's probably important. The last section we're going to be talking about is this. Types. Valid distinctions like masculine and feminine. Don't give me shit, I'm just reading it. The Enneagram categories, Jung's archetypes and typology, and among others. Types have qualitative differing interpretations, quadrant perspectives, or preferences, and the line emphasis as they develop. So, let me steelman this first. I think there is a truth to which how you come at development, right, this stuff right here, the stuff in the middle, or how you embody spirituality or states of consciousness are going to be interpreted based on where you're coming from. That's a pretty easy thing we can say. Developmentally speaking, we already talked about that. That's why these are color-coded, right? If you look, you can see that the actual, like, you have rational self, where you go over here and you see all of these orange things, gross, subtle, causal, non-dual. Can't see the non-dual part because my fucking chat's in the way. So we already know that states are interpreted through the developmental lens, but types can do this as well. One can make a very solid argument that both Zen and Christianity are radically masculine disciplines of spirituality. Zen, because it completely sacrifices the body. But again, we're using older variations of the notion of masculine. We're not talking about modern ideas of gender. So I want to be really careful about that. I'm trying to steelman this before we get into the critique. We can talk about how very early forms of Judaism, at least some of the scholars I've talked to, had a lot of feminine energy and even had discussions of a feminine aspect of the divine. That, of course, died out and didn't become the dominant one. But we can see this with a lot of feminine forms of spirituality. There tends to be a preference that gets formed based on bigotry and I would assume levels of sexism, etc. There are people who are way better at history and anthropology that know better than me on this. So, yeah, do your own research. Wilbur argues that each type can then influence which way you have a tendency to go. So, for example, rational self probably is favored by a lot of cis guys who are trying to be, either A, hyper-scientific and rational, right? We got the skeptic community that we're all a bunch of fucking neckbeards. While, say, the humanities, human rights, and things like that tends to be more ascribed as feminine. That's not to say those things are inherent to those. They're not. There's nothing inherent. Remember, I'm an optimistic nihilist in some ways. Nothing's fucking inherent. But there appears to be those biases. Types are useful in some ways to get a better understanding of where you're coming from. I've actually gotten a lot of utility out of, say, the Enneagram system. Now, there's been a little bit of study on Enneagram. I think 1 or 2 studies have found it to be somewhat useful. But the reality is that I think that it's a very useful sort of theoretical mapping of how egos construct. That's my own interpretation. Do with that what you will. But I think the 9 types kind of point out the similarities in which people sort of get messages, miss messages, and how ego constructs over time. The nice thing about that map, too, is it tends to go with development, leading all the way up into early 20s, which a lot of maps don't. But it also has a lot of spiritual woo-woo attached to it and a lot of, questions about its origin and yada yada. So again, take the utility where you can. I find the utility there, you may not. Some people find utility in astrology. I don't. I know those stars are dead. Right? Those stars are basically, by the time the light gets to us, they have so utterly moved from their position that even the shape that they're corresponding to is gone. But if that system works for you to understand people, and you're not being bigoted towards people for it, I don't really care a whole bunch. I'm not a fan, but you do you. Masculine and feminine do have some useful descriptions in a utility sense if we ignore modern gender stuff. I'll get to that in a minute. Jungian archetypes, same thing. I've seen a joke saying Jungian archetypes are astrology for dudes, and I agree. There is a lot of data showing that these things just don't have a lot of correspondence. Their data's really shaky. It's not the bestest. But if you find utility, I don't care. The goal is always, what is the value? This is why I don't think spirituality inherently is worthless. I just think that for it to be worthwhile, we have to look at it from a utilitarian sense, or at least a semi-utilitarian sense, because every time I say that I'm at least somewhat of a utilitarian, people go, well, how is this utility? How is this? I don't care. My views will shift and change as necessary to make them make sense and consent and make them functionally similar in my own head. Because again, humans are irrational. Fuck you. If you're fetishizing rationality, spoiler alert, you need to read the orange part again. Because some shit is just not rational. So, this is our system. And These are its things. What are the problems with it? Let's go over it. A long time ago, I and a friend had a thing that we did that was basically talking about one of the biggest issues we had with the integral community. Despite the fact that we both really liked the theory, we liked the mapping system, at least marginally, what we saw was a lot of bad fucking takes coming out of that. And we started to realize why that was. There were a lot of people connected to the spiral dynamics and the integral community who were very excited about it, but then also wanted to take the thing they were excited about and try to monetize it. Okay. Not the end of the world, I suppose. But the problem being is that by being so willing to fetishize the map, they missed a lot. This would lead to people talking about entrepreneurship. They would talk about being, life coaches and all this other crazy shit. And that's all fine and good. If someone's getting benefit out of that, I don't care. But the issue I have here, the issue that I really am bothered by here, is that then Occupy Wall Street happened. That'll tell you how far back this is and how fucking old I am. Occupy Wall Street happened, and we saw bad take after bad fucking take. Essentially what had happened is a lot of the people that were really enjoying their six-figure income got really upset about the idea about wanting to do something about capitalism. Now, I have my critiques about Occupy myself. Occupy was fucked from the get-go. Its messaging was not great, it was vague, and it didn't really have any really strong policy goals, and it was very deeply, deeply infiltrated by racists, white supremacists, members of the alt-right, libertarians. I mean, I could go to a talk at an Occupy rally, and it would be 1 minute we need to do socialism, next minute we need unfettered capitalism. Again, like this is the utter lack of consistency in any way, shape, or form. Right? At least if you're talking about a group message, that maybe needs to be a little more consistent. But the takes we would see, the problems we would see, would be something to the effect of, this is just mean green. And this was a habit these motherfuckers absorbed from Wilbur. Specifically that this stage of development, sensitive self, or color-coded SDI is green, or Wilbur's green, anytime some bitch brought up social democracies, informational starting around 150 years ago, pluralism, seeking inner peace and caring community, power with, solidarity, human rights activity, etc. People would do this thing where they would sort of placate that idea and say like, oh, there's some really good useful things there. And then every time shit like that came up, it would just be, you're being green. I'm not joking. These motherfuckers would just reduce you to a color. Not even joking. They would reduce you to a color and basically go, well, that's just mean green. Because when you would get mad and say, no, I think you're being kind of racist, or I think you're being kind of transphobic, or you're being classist, that was their comeback. I'm not joking. They would literally come back with this idea that they were supposedly like above it all. Because, of course, the problem is whenever you establish a hierarchy where there appears to be some sort of fucking meritocracy, spoiler alert, everyone assumes they're up here. Very few motherfuckers actually got testing. I did. I know where I'm at least according to Susan Cook-Reuter's system. Because I needed to know. Assuming was fucking screwing with me. And CSY brings up a good point. The problem is this shit sounded like this and doing the mean green shit. It was doing the fucking SJW stuff. Like, these motherfuckers would come around and basically say you were doing this and not own any of their shit, not bring up any of their problems, not talk about any of the things that they were holding on to for dear life because they were so convinced that through theory they could save capitalism from being what it is, or they just ignore all the predatory bullshit in and of itself. To which we took offense and made a joke, Facebook page and made fun of the fuckers. And then weirdly got confused for journalists and did some actual real investigative stuff. It was weird. Anywho. It was a weird fucking time. Undergrad was a hell of a drug. Anyway. The point being is that Wilbur's system, because Wilbur had spent most of the time growing up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, being surrounded by a lot of the people at this stage of development, got really triggered by it and talked a lot of shit about them. He would talk about their goodness and use, but what people heard was the negative information bias, right? Negative bias. This is a real thing people suffer from. The negative sounds more true, especially about ourselves. But also, if Daddy Wilbur said it was bad, it must be bad. Right? And so, the problem is that you're talking about in the early 2010s, a rendition of philosophically informed individuals following this particular person who basically were just doing an early proto version of the fucking 2016, 2015 anti-SJW shit. Like, I'm not joking. This is what they were doing. Now, it's funny, and I'm not going to name any names because that shit gets me in trouble, but a few of those people went on to being alt-right and calling black people Nazis. So I'm just saying, if you stare at something hard enough and you're a dumbass, you can easily make it bend around your nonsensical and frankly, God, what? Racist, transphobic, fill in the blank group? Pointing out fundamental flaws in the system. Commie, right? So that's one of the big things, is that in a lot of ways, one of my larger critiques about integral theory is that integral theory essentially aborted civil rights. It would do small passes about it, it would discuss it, and I don't think Wilbur was against these things. I genuinely don't. I think that he was for them, but I also think that he had a massive shadow around this. And he called this coming from a higher stage of development because his higher stages do account for that. But the problem is that he's not really accounting for the fact of own personal bias. I don't think this is an issue with his higher stages of development having that allergy. I think the issue is that he has that allergy. He has that problem. Because he heard it through a majority of his life in the 60s and 70s. And to be fair, there were a lot of people talking about these ideas that were dumbasses. But does that mean all the ideas were bad? No. It also doesn't account for things that Wilbur didn't really think about. Remember, this is the 2010s. Well, trans rights was growing. That wasn't something that came up didn't come up very often. And again, Integral had no interest in what it seemed like with those concepts of allyship. Because again, what you guys aren't accounting for is, again, we're talking about a system of theory, and that theory, in and of itself, because of the author's biases and because of the monetary incentive of the people there, had a direct and complete bias against those concepts. Think about that. Wilbur, you'll hear this, and again, this is going to be hard for y'all, but when we watch that Ken Wilber, Dr. Cornell West stuff, that commentary came out before they transitioned. I don't know where that's at now. Interesting thing to think about. They were, the Wachowski sisters were in integral communities. I know that for a fact because they actually were involved in things like Integral Life, which is a website that covers integral theory stuff. So that's the first critique. The larger second one is this. I think quadrants as a concept is useful. I also think quadrants as a concept needed to be looked at more clearly because I think people do have biases towards them. And the major one I see all of the time is people love these ones. Half the motherfuckers don't get systems, and nobody talks about this unless you're at green. Think about it. If you're an SJW or you're somebody coming from a level of development where you're talking about community systems, culture, multiculturalism, diversity, guess what? You're going to sound like this. But nobody accounts for that shit, so they ignore this stuff. If I had the largest critique I could ever levy at this shit is the level of abortion conceptually that happened with this quadrant. Because while it was always paid to some level of lip service, its actual utility was awful. I can't go into specifics, but there are issues that happened 10 years back where people that were supposed to be incredibly well informed, people who had behaved incredibly well, people that were actually teaching other individuals lots of really useful shit, because they couldn't own their own shadows and they didn't want to actually own their own fucking triggers. And because the way in which they ignored their effects on the systems became toxic. Wilbur did this incredibly. Wilbur had a real bad habit of inviting spiritual teachers to the community who had bad habits. I can probably mention a couple without. Allegedly, some of these people included spiritual teachers who were abusive to their students, physically and emotionally. One such person was a person who was... I can't give away too much, but I will say that this person was allegedly accused of being very inappropriate with a teenager and also being somewhat predatory towards women in the community. Funny story about that guy is, as much as he's a sleaze and as much as I really didn't like him after finding out all this stuff, I actually met him in person. Again, I'm not going to say his name, but there's a thing when you get into spiritual communities where you sit around people enough, you start to get a lot of really interesting vibes about people. The vibes were strong with that one. Super impressive, like knocked me the fuck out. I'm not even joking. Someday we'll talk about what that stuff means. But my point being is, this person wowed me on a very real spiritual level. And this was me deep in Zen at that point. This person was a very different path. And yet, finding out all that stuff, you realize, again, waking up doesn't just mean spiritual shit. It also means developmental shit. And some people don't own their shit and go back to deal with it. One of the things my teacher Junpo mentioned is, again, there's lots of people walking around who are awake and then fucked up and acted like toxic assholes, his own teacher included. So, what's my point? My point is, this is an issue with these people. As I've said before, one of the reasons why I haven't been interacting with my own Zen community is, despite the fact that I love them and I love what Junpo built, seeing members of that community share the right-leaning talking point of Sweden not doing lockdowns, seeing people share things about Black Lives Matter and the Proud Boys working together, or seeing members who would literally make comments in groups discussing, oh, hey, these women were like, by a Zen teacher were actively, sexually coerced using power dynamics, right? If someone's literally called your master, that might be a fucking problem. Guess what? They were literally said, well, these people had choice, they could leave. Ignoring all of this shit from the lower left. All of it. It just disappears. It just falls out of their head. It just turns into the right-leaning thing of, oh, it's just independent choice with no idea of factors that cause you to think in other directions or might make you hesitant. If your entire spiritual identity is connected to this person and you're being abused, do you really think it's that easy to leave? Holy shit. And this was a problem throughout. Not to mention the monetization of spirituality and development, which is a very real thing. Types are problematic because they suck. While some of these, like I've noticed, Enneagram, for example, I find utility in. Masculine and feminine, sure, I can ascribe those systems, but why? Why can't we be more specific? Why can't we be more clear? Well, there appears to be some utility in the idea of, let's explore this and look at how this works. The problem is that these types become reductive. You would have people who would struggle to talk about queer identities with this shit. A really good example of this is one such teacher who was a yoga teacher and sexualist? I forget what he was. But basically, his whole thing was talking about the masculine and feminine dynamics of sexual interaction. To be perfectly honest, what he was talking about is tops and bottoms. But big oof, he couldn't fucking just use those terms. And then when it came up to like giving a passive shout to gay people, talking about how those dynamics exist there, but again, not owning the fact that gay people have their own fucking terms for that. It's called tops and bottoms. But on top of that, refusing, just utterly fucking refusing to consider what that might mean in regards to, say, someone who is transgender. There's a lot of absence of transgender people. There was also a lot of climate change questioning. The problem with integral theories is because it is a generalized theory that has a use. It has a use based on your intention. But if your intentions are to use it to reify your nonsense, spoiler, you're going to keep doing that, like any system, just like Christians do with the Bible to hurt gay people, just like lots of people do when they want to use whatever faith or whatever philosophy to be harmful. And because the people here behind this were a lot of like white dudes who are really, really happy about it and interested in it. And then, you know, women were interested in it too, and they showed up too. It had a lot of masculine energy. Really uncomfortable, someone in the closet. Time I was too stupid, so I didn't notice it. I just noticed I was really uncomfortable with some of the hyper-masculine bullshit. Right? Hard to murder someone with a trowel, but if you stab hard enough, like, tools have uses and tools can be used for harm. And here's the issue. I still think this map has utility, but I do think its generalizations are problematic. Now, I want to be really clear. I'm not the most well-read. I have read several books by Wilbur. I haven't read all of them, nor have I read his extensive collection known as, Sex Ecology and Spirituality. So I want to be clear with this. You need to do the research if you find utility in this. I am not doing it for you. I think Integral Spirituality is a great book, and it brings up some shit that I actually think is really relevant to today. Wilbur mentions that developmentally speaking, and I mean, this is not going to go over well with people because, again, Vosh gets this and a bunch of other people get this. Developmentally speaking, about 70% of people in the country are at the same stage of development as the Germans were when Adolf Hitler was made the Chancellor of Germany. No joke. The same authoritarian system, the same authoritarian stage of development was in power then and still exists in people because everyone starts at zero. 70% of the United States fall into this, at least in the first world. This is dependent in other categories, but at least for America, that's a thing. And as he jokes in there, and I still hold this to be true, 70% of people have the possibility and can easily become fascists. It's built into the system. It's built into that stage of development. This is why I'm very distrustful of conservatives. This is also why I think that conservatism naturally leads to this progression. It's made by the same systems. It just changes and adapts. It's the bare fucking grills of fucking political idea because it doesn't need to have policy. It only needs rhetoric, culture war, and other bullshit. When was the last time a real policy decision was made that wasn't just attacking a particular group? The point I want to make with all of this is that integral theory has its uses. It also has a lot of problems built into it, and a lot of assumptions based on the cis white hetero nature of Wilbur. I think it's reductive to tribes, for example. Lower stages of development do make sense in some ways, but as someone pointed out to me, one of the pitfalls of the instinctive self is he literally uses the term autism. This is incredibly ableist. This is not true. What he was pointing at was early fusion with reality, the way that kids have to differentiate subject-object referencing. That's not autism. Autism is a different thing. This is the type of shit that I have a problem with, is when people come at me about this saying, why are you sharing this? Why are you sharing this? How could you possibly believe this when you're rational about other stuff? Because I come at this rationally too, or at least semi-rationally. I'm not fetishizing rationality or post-rationality. All I'm trying to point out is, I think this theory would be useful because it explains where I'm coming from in a lot of ways, because I think there's use here. There's understanding. Do you guys get why I come to the conclusions that I do? Because I look at things through this map. There's a reason why I've agreed with Vosh on his takes about fascism. There's a reason why I've basically called a whole bunch of shit in my past. Shit like calling out the alt-right coming to power. The fact that 4chan became a fucking, radicalization platform. All of these things make sense when you look at them through integral theory. There's some use there. But this theory is very, very Western. And I mean that in the, what is that, Jordan B. Peterson nonsense way, where it is assuming a lot of shit. And it's assuming that there aren't variations of these stages of development that might come up in different ways, or understanding how those might be. Because I've heard people use some really dumb takes to try to explain certain civilizations when those civilizations would actually be much higher on the totem pole. Again, not to make too much of a point on this, but someone pointed out, like, this thing is really reductive to tribal systems. Yeah. Because I think Wilbur conflated tribal level spirituality, that is that stage of development from a spiritual perspective, the spiritual line, right? One with the spirits, energy, all that shit. But then didn't look at individual tribes and saw like some were probably much more highly developed than others. I disagree with that, Green Kachik. But we'll talk about that in the Q&A section. So I'm going to end this part here. There probably will be other videos because I don't feel like I covered everything, but I feel like we've covered a lot and we ran a little bit over. So stay around. We're going to end this section here, and then we're going to get into Q&A. All right, so here we are, and we're going to be going over Q&A. We don't have a ton of questions, but we do want to cover these because I want people to be as informed as possible. I know this video is a little bit of a different format because we're kind of going over large metacritiques. I think it's really important to make sure that if you're not getting any of this stuff or you feel like you've missed something, there is an entire fucking playlist. Yes. I realize we are covering a lot. If you're trying to enter the Discord, make sure you read through the rules and then follow what the rules and instructions say. You can't enter the Discord without following those directions. So, just as an FYI. So, we're going to go through these questions as we get them, try to get them in as fast as possible, and Zena, let's begin.
All right, so from the Green Kachik, how does framing things as stages of development not infantilize or undermine people's ways of thinking that may just be different? How does it not create a hierarchy based upon Western values?
So there's two separate assumptions or questions there. Let's cover the first one because I think it's the more problematic one. I dislike what you're saying about the notion of it being infantilizing because stages of development are not made for that. I think there's an assumption that if you're on a lower stage that you are somehow less than. And while a lot of integral people did absolutely fall for that fucking fallacy, it's not true. Different stages of development have value, but those values are not determined by a hierarchical system. I think it's very easy to interpret that way, but one of the things Wilbur said, and I still think this is true, is that every stage of development is true but partial. That is, each of them are disclosing some truth about existence, reality, experience, whatever you want to call it, and it's partial due to the limitations of that stage. Like, a good way to say this is, when we're talking about children, nobody gets upset when you say a kid is at, like, this stage of development, depending on the line we're talking about. Who gets upset about this is adults, because adults get butthurt about the idea that they are somehow not still developing. You say this and they think they're less than, or they're somehow... You say that you think they're somehow saying they're less than, or they're somehow inferior. Facets of a gem, and perhaps different sizes of facets, because each one discloses more light, but not necessarily better or worse than one another. This is the mistake a lot of people made because they thought, go for the higher stages, everything below them doesn't matter, which actually misses Wilbur's earlier comments. What he wanted, or what he thought, was you would, at what he called second tier, we've covered this in the other videos, but when you would get to integral self or second tier, what it would get to is you would look at the previous stages not as like better or worse or have an allergy to them, at least hopefully. What it would be is they would be almost like a paintbrush, right? And so you could walk into a situation where, you know, let's say a prison. I've seen counselors do this, where this is a person clearly very developed, very, very like nuanced in their thinking, and they can walk into a prison and just get along with the people there. Now, prisons, I'm not saying everybody in prison isn't intelligent or capable, but the social systems that push people to behave as they do in prisons are very power dynamic based. And as such, you're dealing with a lot of people who are at that lower level power self, right? Egocentric development, very self-focused. And you can talk to them and you can interact with them and understand them because you have a way to understand and inform them because you can feel that part of yourself. This is the thing that everyone misunderstands. When you move from one stage, you're not getting rid of the previous stages. It's a ladder. The problem is that when you start to move up the ladder, it's not like the lower rungs stop mattering. The ladder would just fall apart. The point is that you need every step to get up there. They build off one another. That's why each one is allergic to the previous one, because it realizes its errors and problems. Make sense? So that's the problem, is to say that it's infantilizing is really missing the mark, because what you're doing is, I think in this case is, I think one, this is a critique the left has all of the time, because anytime we talk about development or we talk about ways in which people are being reductive, people get unhappy because they think we're saying they're not equal or they're dumb or whatever. And I think there's a difference between talking about observable phenomenon and a person's behavior and their arguments. Their argument can be coming from any stage of development versus they're at this level. And so we need to get past this allergy we have as the left about talking about people being in different places in the social hierarchy, because we can do this when we're talking about marginalized people, but be honest, if you're a leftist, you think you're better than conservatives. You fucking do. And if you say you don't, you're fucking lying. So that's the first part. The second part is, how does it not create a hierarchy upon Western values? It does. I mentioned this in the critiques, but the problem is that I think Wilbur looked only at Western cultures and some Eastern cultures and didn't try to figure out where the differences came in there in a way that would make more sense and be a little bit more like hybridized between them. I also think that, yeah, it does reify some of that stuff. Now, I'm going to say a spicy take, and I'm going to get fucking shit for this, and I don't care. I think multiculturalism and diversity is good. I also think it has limits. I think there are universal goods that make sense for humanity as a whole, but we have to be very careful with those statements. And I know I'm going to get shit on this. This is something someone posted on the LGBT video when we were talking about Afghanistan. They went, oh, this is just pinkwashing. Why should we stay in Afghanistan if, you know, there's just gay people there? This is pushing an imperialist agenda, blah, 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 blah. You're a fucking idiot. I'm sorry. You just are. If you are so stuck in your fucking head that you're like, oh, we're maintaining an imperialist agenda by being aware of this marginalized group that's been given the ability to talk about things like socialism, Marxism, and fucking like queer theory, or being able to even just practice being the sexual orientation they are, or fucking be trans, or even just talk about being trans. That's a market improvement. This idea that, like, because it came from the West, it's inherently bad, or because there are these very complicated ways that these systems come about is inherently good or bad, is really weird. I'm very careful with that language because I know there are a bunch of people in the Discord that are going to fucking mad at me. But this is the truth. There are things that I believe are universal goods. One of them is queer theory. One of them is queer identities. I don't give a fuck who the culture is. Everyone deserves human fucking rights. Full stop. I don't give a fuck about your religion. I don't give a fuck about any other system you ever could put out there that would somehow give you the idea that it would be okay to do that. To harm some group. This is the fundamental problem I have. You see this with tankies. Tankies get upset because they're like, oh, it's Western propaganda. You saw this from fucking Mel and other things like that. There are just people that, because it's the West, it's bad. And I've actually heard people like make arguments of like LGBT acceptance is a Western psyop or some shit like that. To bring a new form of imperialism to the rest of the world. How are you this dumb? I'm sorry. I don't normally talk like this, but when you tell me that tell me things like that, I cannot understand that. Sometimes there are hierarchies. Not all hierarchies are bad. Not all hierarchies are good. Some should be abolished. Any that harm human rights are one of them. And I don't give a fuck about culture in that system. I move towards what I believe to be the good. If someone proves to me that the thing I believe is good is wrong and I need to edit my ideas, I try to. But human rights will always trump whatever culture or religious or any other thing like that tries to be some sort of control mechanism. Fuck that shit. I'm not okay with it. And this is why this whole discussion of hierarchies gets really hard for me. Yes, we live in a Western culture. Yes, that is part of our biases. But also, that doesn't mean we're always wrong. Try to see the good. Try to understand. Try to get as much utility and understanding and good out of as many cultures and understanding. I'm not saying a Western-centric perspective is good or that it's the only way you should come at it from. But what I'm saying is if your immediate like knee-jerk reaction is ever, this came from this, it's bad, or this came from this, it's good, that's fucked. So I'm going to leave that there because otherwise I'm going to go on a fucking 4-hour tangent. Next question.
There's some pretty good comments too. So.
Yeah, we can, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so from Ash, how do agender people fit in with the masculine and feminine energy? Also, how are some ways that the left could use, what are some ways that the left could use this theory aside from seeing where conservatives come from?
So I would argue that agender people don't really fit in that system, at least as the types part, because I think types doesn't really take in trans identities. I think the whole fucking thing needs to be rewritten, at least for the types aspect. There was somebody, and I can't remember their name right now, who was actually trying to use queer identities and then talk about them as a type system, but it got like fractally complex. It was one of those things you stare at and you get cross-eyed. And so my concern is that I don't know if agender fits in the way that it should, and my should is, again, that's my ought statement that's coming from my own values and beliefs, whatever. Also, what are some of the ways the left can use this theory? Okay. Spicy take time. 1, I think that the use to understand conservative ideas, as well as what conservatives fear and why they're drawn into rhetoric and propaganda, are useful. Integral theory answers that, at least in some ways. 1. 2, I think integral theory actually explains tankies. People who want a post-conventional understanding, cognitively speaking, about understanding economics and moving beyond capitalism, but are coming from a very low stage of development values-wise, because they immediately abort human rights and immediately want to put in authoritarianism. Think about that. The system actually accounts for why tankies are a thing. How can you believe in a postmodern system of thinking that looks at systems like Marx and then have this weird moral issue where you're like, we'll just send them to the gulag? It's because there's two different lines being represented. I think there's utility there to understand not only the issues of conservatives, but also the problems with people on the left who really have lost their way. Hell, it explains the Nazbol vortex. The Nazbol vortex is really explainable by a simple thing. These are people whose value is to always assume that both parties are equal, and then what they do is they then take and use their systems of interpretation to go, the Democrats are the real issue because they're not doing enough, which then leads to people falling more right-leaning. It's rhetoric. It regresses you developmentally. Right? So that's my argument. Those are just three or four off the top of my head. If I had to think about it for a while, I could probably come up with more. But you could also see where this exists, like with people freaking out about Hassan's house. No joke. Hassan's house, that whole thing, is just a giant values question. So that's my thought on it. Next one. I believe that one is the next one.
Yeah, from Emily Chirtos. Is this a baseline for critique on Tro's video?
No, it's not. I mean, Tro's video has issues, not huge ones, but because I like it, but we'll cover that when we get to that.
That's just a different segment. Yeah.
Yeah. Next one. We have our last one.
From Minerva. Can we leave questions here, potentially for a future segment from when/if we do our own rating?
Yeah, I don't mind leaving it there as long as people are using it only for that discussion. I'll answer questions when I have time, but yeah, I mean, I'm fine leaving it there.
Yeah, we can leave this channel out. Yeah, we'll leave it out.
If it's not getting used or I don't see it used in a couple months, then or maybe a month or so, maybe we'll just pop it back in archive, but yeah. But I do highly recommend. So with those questions asked, here's what I'm going to say. Homework is this. If you guys want to understand the stuff beyond our normal book reading, integral spirituality, a theory of everything, if you want to be a badass of reading, because I'm not, sex ecology and spirituality. I also think there's some really good thing. Integral life plan. That one's a really good one if you want to start doing some more stuff for yourself. I think there's use there. I think there is still use there. And I actually genuinely believe that. So with that, as there are no more questions, why don't we call this here? Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for participating in this. We are going to keep trying to do as many discussions on this as we can, and we will see you in the next one.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. You can also ring the bell if you want to be notified of our videos. If you want to help the channel, you can donate at streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. You also can become a patron at patreon.com/transgirltherapist. For as low as $3, you can support our channel. Thanks for watching.